And I would not like you to think that I think all these are cast in stone. I think we're struggling with some of these, but theoretically and practically it does feel that this is a very useful way of moving into a segment. So let's take this segment here, okay, as being the one that we want to move. And the movement that is lost at that segment is rotation to the right, inflection. So when I came like this and I tried to do that, it wouldn't go particularly. I'm not trying to say whether it's this joint that won't close or that joint that won't open, but we'll say it's this joint that won't go forward on this side. All right, now, what we decided to do was we could use a congruent movement from above, if we didn't want to make it too harsh, which would mean that we cannot change the flexion and we cannot change the rotation to the right. Those are the things that's got to take place at this joint. But we can change the side flexion. And so with a congruent movement, we would be using flexion, right rotation, right side flexion. That would be the congruent locking position. If we wanted to use the non-congruent, then inflection, we would put it into left side flexion, which means it's stable against rotation to the right. So the first joint that can really right rotate is this one, which we're keeping in its neutral position. Okay? Now then, we talked about whether we hold this in lordosis or whether we hold it in reduced lordosis, inflection. All right? Now, there may be a slight difference of consideration here. If we hold it in lordosis, what we said was we're not going to really talk about congruent and non-congruent because it's a bit confusing. What we'll talk about is just making it stable against rotation to the right. So what we're going to do is we're going to put it so it's stable against rotation right. We'll place it in rotation left. Now we've two possibilities. Are we going to hold it in extension or are we going to hold it in flexion? Okay, here's a little consideration. If we hold it in lordosis, there's the buttock here, we're going to put the wedge under that buttock, which side flexes to the right, which in lordosis rotates to the left, which means that the principles we're trying to adhere to make it stable against right rotation are correct. So it's stable against right rotation. Now then, can we go back to this joint now here? What we're going to try and do is to make sure that the rotation this way gets into this joint. We've made it stable against rotation this way. All these can't rotate that way. So the first joint that can rotate that way will be this one here. So we take it into slight flexion. We take it into rotation to the right. Now then, what kind of side flexion should we have at that joint? We should have right side flexion. Now we've already produced right side flexion in this lordosis. So if we let the side flexion get up into that joint, then we perhaps have got the correct side flexion to the right for rotation to the right in flexion. So there may be a slight difference of consideration of this lordosis, but we still mustn't let the lordosis get too high because we want this in its neutral position to go into flexion. So when we're dealing with all this, once you've got this in sitting, you're going to find in lying it's not so complicated. And I'll finish on this thing here. If we are going to use the and I'll only mention this and we'll stop on this. If we're going to use the extension lever, okay, what did we do? We side flexed and rotated to the same side, which locks the extension lever if we're working from above downwards. So if we've got a patient inside lying, okay, and I want to take them back and use this upper lever rather than the classical lower lever taken forward for rotation, I would simply lift the bed up so that they side flex and rotate to the same side in extension, which means all this is locked and I can use this as a lever. Whereas if I wanted to use a flexion lever, I would put a pillow under the side that they're laying on, which would side flex them towards the side of the pillow, which means that they would be stable for this, because this produces stability for right rotation, because it produces left rotation. If it produces left rotation and we hold the left side flexion, it's stable against right rotation. And so this is how all of this works. And it's not as difficult as you think. If you want to take the lower lever and hold it in lordosis, you just think about this thing. We put the wedge under this side so that if we've got the patient laying and we want to produce movement on this side, we'd lift up the lower end of the table in extension. Or we'd drop it down as it was on this side if we wanted to put that into flexion. So all of these things are going to be related to this sitting thing. So, would you tonight, if you can just spend 15 minutes on this, just draw a little diagram like this and have it all worked out so that when we try this in the lying positions, you can kind of translate this in your brains into a different position.
Just to clarify again on this scenario, below you locked again the opposite rotation to lock below. Now above, what you wrote there, then you were using a congruent method because you rotated inside bend the same way above.
Yep. And then we sort of talked about the non-congruent.
So that would be you just would change your side
Yeah.
flexion above.
Yes. Yeah.
Everything below would stay the same.
Yes.
Because it's already locked in.
Yeah. Unless we wanted to change it into a reduced lordosis. But the advantage of perhaps leaving it in the lordosis is that this side flexion, if we can get it up into that, is the appropriate side flexion to go with that rotation. I don't know that it just came to me that as I was wandering around as to why this might be an advantage. I tend to use this, and it may be it feels better, and it may be that we're just letting the two correct side go on at the same spot. I know Evian, when he talks about rotation, he says, let's let the rotation go right down into that affected joint. And it could be that when we're talking from below upwards, we'll let the side flexion go up into that joint, the correct side flexion. So that would give us an advantage of the lordosis. Well, day one, finished. Always a good time, isn't it? I've almost got your names under control, except I keep forgetting from time to time, so I shall go and study the map tonight of your names. But Bruce, I can see that spider right above your head, no problem. I'm still having a bit of problem with Tim, I don't know why. Perhaps it's my antipathy towards political figures, Tim. But sitting there, I've no problem. Very I regret to tell you we're going to start on a slight difference of opinion today. Okay? Now, this is because obviously if we've got a difference of opinion within ourselves, we've never really tried to hide any of these, nor do we think it's a very good idea to come up with a kind of a consensus where everybody more or less agree. If we've got a disagreement, we should try and prove our point, prove it to our colleagues. If we can't prove it, we just accept that there is a difference of opinion. Now, what I'd like you to do just for a second is to just start at the point where we finished last night, which was looking at the features of mobilization in sitting. We did it in sitting because it's very useful, for one thing, but also it's a little easier to interpret what you're doing in sitting because we are more in the usual anatomical position that we can kind of recognize. Plus the fact that if you're trying to give a patient a kind of an exercise that's got some degree of specificity in it, It's much easier to show them an exercise in a sitting or a standing position, for example, than it is if you've got them in a side-lying position going into all kinds of contortions. They'll never reproduce that. Indeed, we sometimes have difficulty in reproducing it ourselves, don't we? You kind of, on your bad days, you think to yourself, geez, have I got this the right way round? So, as far as patients are concerned, I think we have to accept that. Oh, thanks. No, that'll be fine just as it is. Thanks, great.
Here, this is for the table.
Good, thank you. What service, Anne? Don't get that at home. My wife, I spoke to her last night, she was grumbling that there was nobody to bring her a tea in bed in the morning. Okay, so if you could just think of those things we did yesterday. If we had a segment here and why we chose various things. Let's make this L3 and let's make that L4, which gives us a couple of segments below and many segments above. Now then, there are a number of things we had to ask ourselves about this particular segment, weren't they? What movement was lost? Now, generally speaking, we're going to find a combination of movements. It's going to perhaps have in a rotation component that's restricted, or it will have in a side flexion component that's restricted. And generally speaking, we will find this a little bit more exaggerated in flexion or in extension. Those are features that we can't necessarily change. On the other hand, we could have a situation where the flexion and extension components didn't appear to be particularly important, but we needed to produce the maximum motion possible, let's say, in the zygapophyseal joint. And we know that the best way of producing a gapping in the zygapophyseal joint is by rotation, because it maximally separates the joint surfaces. And so we could have that as a consideration. So here's one set of considerations. Here's another consideration where we need to get maximum mobilization of the facet, and so we need to get a gapping of the Z joint. All right. Now, if we've got this situation where we've got a loss of, say, rotation, and we find it in flexion or extension, what we said was that if we're going to use the upper lever, which of course is the easiest way around to do this as we're just describing it, that if this is lost and let's say rotation to the right is lost, actually we should put that down as a cross, I guess, that's lost, we have to put those movements into the lever, and that's very well described in your notes in terms of why we use things, what localization is about. Earl or Jim Meadows, whoever wrote that sort of section, has just explained very well what localization is. There's a slight difference in what the principles are, but in terms of the explanation of localization, excellently done. So that we know that if we have got to produce a flexion and a right rotation at this stiff segment, that these two movements of flexion and right rotation must be part of that lever. Because it would be impossible to hold this in extension and then produce a very local flexion at that joint. We could do it from bottom upwards, but not from above downwards in this scenario. So those, whatever lever we're using, whether it be the lower lever or the upper lever, and in this case we're using the upper lever, the two movements that are lost must be a component of that lever, which only gives us the possibility of what to do with side flexion. This is the only variable, side flexion. So we ask ourselves, do we want the lever to be a softish lever? In other words, to relieve the stresses somewhat, or do we need the lever to be a very firm lever so that the whole stress is applied to this joint here? That's the consideration. If we want to sort of dissipate the forces somewhat and leave a degree of flexibility in the lever, then we'd use a congruent locking. In other words, we would go into the appropriate movements, the coupled movements of flexion and right rotation. So for a congruent lever in flexion, right rotation, we would use a right side flexion, because those are the movements. If we wanted to make this much more firm but still retain the features of flexion and right rotation, then we'd use a non-congruent, which would be in left side flexion. And those were the things that we tried to achieve yesterday in terms of the feeling of them. Now then, all else being equal, and perhaps the movement that we are trying to achieve is a gapping movement of the Z joint. And if we wanted to use the upper lever as opposed to the lower lever, perhaps, for example, the lower lever here has got a hypermobile joint in it, so we don't actually want to try and stress through that hypermobile joint. So we try to use the upper lever. Then, all else being equal, and if rotation is the only thing that we are concerned with, we'd probably choose to use the upper lever in extension, because extension levers are firmer, even with non-congruency, than are flexion levers, because the apposition of the zygapophyseal joints is just greater in extension than it is in flexion. So these are the sort of considerations that you should have. There will be other ones too, which we will get to when we come to just the practicality of doing things. But extension levers provide firmness. Flexion levers with the non-congruency provide firmness, but not quite as solid as an extension lever with non-congruency. Now then, we saw that when we do the rotation, we would take the rotation to the right, down into the 3-4 joint, which is the joint that we are trying to mobilize. Now then, we've got, what do we do? Let us eliminate this possibility now. What do we do with the lower lever here? We can place that in a variety of positions.
Are you still talking about the gapping example?
Yes, we're still talking now about, we've decided what to do with the upper lever, we've decided either a congruent or a non-congruent lock. Now we've got to decide what's the best thing to do with the lower lever. Okay, and we've seen with the lower lever, we can consider whether to hold this in flexion or in lordosis. That's the first thing. And then the big consideration, isn't it, is to make it stable for right rotation. I'm going over this now because I know yesterday you looked a little bit dreamy at the end of the day. So we'll sort of just do this in the same detail as we did yesterday, and it'll stick a little bit better. And I said to you yesterday that I think that we're talking about congruency and non-congruency above, but I think that we should change the terminology below to make it a little simpler for us to understand. And the big thing to say to ourselves is, how can I make this stable against right rotation? The two ways we can do it, or there's one way we can do it, we can place it in left rotation. That's the big thing. So to make it stable for right rotation, we position it in left rotation. Okay, now the consideration is, are we going to use the flexion or are we going to use the lordosis? Now, in what I told you yesterday, and I hope it's a defensible position, the locking and the congruency in flexion and extension are different. And that's not what the same is in your notes. So I'm going to sort of go over that with you so that you realize that there is a difference of opinion, and it doesn't, think that what I told you, I misunderstood what was in there. I want to let you know that there is a difference of opinion. What I'm saying is that the coupled movement in lordosis is side flexion rotation opposite, and in flexion it's side flexion rotation to the same side. So, this is the principles that we're working on. This is the principles that are ascribed to in Olaf Evians, all of his stuff, including the muscle stretching things, and also in Stoddard, the British osteopathic system. And most of the manipulative systems ascribe to this. The difference is in the muscle energy people, who went along with Friart's rules all the time. And we know that even with these so-called rules or this so-called knowledge of coupling, that when we look at motion films, very often it doesn't necessarily always follow this. But what I wanted to do yesterday by asking you to experiment is to challenge these various ideas by doing things for yourselves. And what we saw yesterday was you can get all kinds of findings, but it's usually because you've let go one of the coupled movements. And when we're testing any of this stuff and we're starting to rotate, we've got to make sure, for example, that if we are in extension and we are rotating and side bending this way, that when we rotate, we don't allow a side bend to go in the opposite direction or in the direction that you don't mean to do. You've got to hold the side bend. And very often when we're experimenting, what you find is that you can produce this rotation which seems all right, but you've let go the side bend that is associated with it. So when you're doing any of this kind of little experimental work, to try and convince yourself, make sure that if you're just testing rotation or you're just testing side flexion, that the appropriate or the inappropriate, whether you're locking or whether you're not locking, that rotation is kept. That's the problem. And we let this go as we're concentrating, say, on rotation. We let go the side flexion. So when you're experimenting, you've got to make sure that's there. Oh, of course, when you're doing it on patients, you've got to make sure that's there, else the specificity doesn't work as well as it could. So, I just finished this. When we're looking at this here, what we said yesterday was that if we want to make this stable, we take this bone, but not bring it up to here, so we're moving up to here, and we take this here into left rotation. And from my thesis, or the one that I'm following, the school I'm tending to follow, if we go into left rotation up to L4, if we want to hold it in lordosis, it would mean we would produce a right side flexion. We would put the wedge under there if it's lordosis. And if we wanted to produce a left rotation in flexion, we would put the wedge under that side so that we get a side flexion to the left, which in flexion produces a rotation to the left. Now then, there are two advantages in this scenario of using lordosis. One is that the lordosis tends to also be stable against the flexion of the upper lever. So that's kind of a good thing. And the other thing that I suggested yesterday was that it may be a feature that the side flexion that we get from the lordosis, we could perhaps move up to that point there so that the congruency of L3-4 is gained by also having side flexion in the presence of flexion and right rotation from above.
Can you say that one more time?
Yes, that when we look at this joint, we're talking about flexion and right rotation, but we would like, because that joint is being taken into flexion, to use the coupling there, which includes right rotation, which means it would have to have right side flexion. And as we've produced right side flexion with the lordosis locking, it may be that we could move that up and it sort of encourage the correct side flexion at this level with the appropriate flexion and right rotation. I don't know that that's a great big thing. It was just something thinking about it yesterday, that this is perhaps one other reason why this seems to be kind of a superior position to use with the lower spine in lordosis.
So you're just saying that we should, if you're thinking about it like that, we should think about producing side flexion with our lower lever, maybe in the same direction that we're producing side flexion with our upper lever.
Yes, on this particular scenario, which means that,
It may aid in the
yeah,
movement at the gap.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
That becomes a congruent movement.
yes, and that's, yes,
Take it to
yeah.
non-congruent, then you're kind of
Yeah, and this is why I say, don't think about non-congruency from the lower lever. It just makes it very complicated. Because what we've used is a congruent positioning, but if this rotation gets down into this, it locks it against rotation to the right. So I think it's better to sort of ignore this non-congruent locking and just simply say to ourselves, in this lower lever, how do I make it stable against right rotation? And it seems to, that kind of description seems to be better.
this is more usual to have the lower level in congruent.
No, I don't even want to say that, because in fact it's non-congruent for right rotation. That's all I'm saying. So it's stabilized, but it gets very complicated then, because we're actually positioning it in a congruent position. But it's non-congruent against right rotation if that tries to get into it. That's why I've tried to ignore that congruency, non-congruency from below, and just simply say, let's make it stable against right rotation. And then we don't have quite so much confusion with it. Is that okay? It's the same thing as you're saying. It is a congruent lever, but it becomes non-congruent against right rotation.